In the 3rd century before the birth of Christ, in a land we now call China, a vast kingdom was tearing itself apart, not through foreign invasion or natural disaster, but through the ambitions of competing powers locked in a struggle for supremacy that would reshape the course of history. This is the story of the Battle of Changping, a confrontation so devastating, so consequential, that it would determine the fate not only of 2 armies, but of an entire civilization. It is a tale of brilliance and hubris, of military genius and political folly, and of the terrible price paid by ordinary soldiers caught in the machinations of power. To understand how such a catastrophe came to pass, we must first step back and see the world as it existed in the year 260 before the Common Era. China was not yet. China not as a unified empire under one rule. Instead, it was a fragmented tapestry of competing states, each asserting its claim to dominance, each viewing its rivals with a mixture of fear and contempt. This was the Warring States period, an era when the old Zhou dynasty had crumbled into memory, and powerful regional kingdoms fought for supremacy using every weapon at their disposal: military might, diplomatic cunning, economic leverage, and the kind of strategic deception that would make even modern statesmen take notes. The 2 great powers locked in this struggle were the state of Qin, rising in the west like an unstoppable force, and the state of Zhao, sitting in the north and northeast, viewing itself as the defender of the old order. Qin had advantages that alarmed its rivals: a population hardened by constant warfare, a system of administration that turned the state into an instrument of war, and a succession of capable generals and shrewd strategists who understood that victory came to those who thought differently about how war should be waged. Zhao, by contrast, was wealthy and cultivated, a great power that had known glory and prestige for centuries. It possessed fertile lands and resources, and it had produced legendary generals whose names were known throughout the warring states. Yet there was a complacency in Zhao's confidence, a belief that their past achievements guaranteed their future security. The immediate cause of conflict centered on a city called Hanadan, the capital of the state of Qin's rival Wei. But the real struggle was for dominance of the entire northern region. Qin saw an opportunity to expand its influence, to weaken its rivals by dominating the central plains. Zhao, viewing this expansion as a direct threat to its own security, committed itself to opposing Qin's ambitions. What began as a localized territorial dispute would spiral into something far more catastrophic, a battle that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives and fundamentally alter the balance of power in China. As armies began mobilizing and rival states positioned their forces like chess pieces on the great board of warfare, the stage was being set for one of history's most consequential encounters. The soldiers who would fight and die at Changping had no idea what awaited them. They were farmers called from their fields, conscripts levied from villages across the countryside, young men who left behind families and fields and the ordinary lives they had known. Some went willingly, inspired by the promise of glory or advancement. Others went because they had no choice, compelled by the demands of the state that now owned their lives as completely as a merchant owns his goods. All of them were about to enter a nightmare from which far too few would ever emerge. The Qin state committed to this campaign its most formidable military instrument, a general named Bai Qi. To understand what made Bai Qi exceptional is to understand how the ancient world viewed warfare and leadership. He was not merely a commander, he was a theorist. A man who had spent his life thinking about how armies moved, how terrain could be used, how morale could be broken or maintained, how supplies could be made to flow or be cut off. He had served Qin through years of conquest and had emerged from those campaigns as perhaps the most feared military figure in all the warring states. His reputation alone had broken armies before he ever drew his sword. Soldiers on the opposing side spoke his name with dread. Generals sent against him often found themselves disadvantaged, not by any defeat before battle, but by the psychological reality of facing someone whose very name suggested an almost inevitable fate. Zhao's initial response to Qin's military movements was to appoint as General Lian Po, a choice that reflected both wisdom and caution. Lian Po was not a flamboyant commander seeking glory through aggressive action. He was a defensive specialist, a general who understood that not all victories came through direct confrontation. He had studied the principles of ancient strategy, understood that sometimes the greatest achievement was preventing an enemy from succeeding, that patience and fortification could neutralize even superior forces. When he arrived at the city of Changping with his army, Lian Po immediately set about establishing a defensive posture that would transform the landscape into an obstacle to Qin's ambitions. Lian Po constructed fortified camps throughout the Changping region. These were not haphazard arrangements of soldiers, but carefully planned defensive positions that took advantage of every feature of the terrain. Mountains, valleys, streams, all were incorporated into a network of defensive positions that would make any direct assault devastatingly expensive. He established supply lines that extended back to Zhao's heartland, ensuring that his army could be sustained over a prolonged campaign. He trained his troops in the discipline of the defensive posture, schooling them in the art of holding ground, of using superior fortifications to neutralize an enemy's numerical advantages or superior tactics. When Bai Qi's armies arrived at Changping, they found themselves not facing an enemy willing to engage in the kind of decisive pitched battle that favored Qin's aggressive tactics, but rather an enemy that had chosen to deny them that opportunity. This was intensely frustrating to Qin's command. A stalemate developed. Months passed. The armies faced each other across the defensive positions Lian Po had created, neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. Supplies had to be transported hundreds of miles across difficult terrain to feed these enormous armies. The logistics of maintaining a stalemate were themselves a form of attrition, slowly bleeding both sides of resources and patience. In Qin's military and political leadership, desperation began to set in. The campaign was becoming expensive, and despite the myth of Qin's military invincibility, there were limits to what even Qin could sustain. Moreover, Qin's ruler felt the political weight of an indecisive campaign. War was supposed to be Qin's great advantage, the source of its power and prestige. An endless stalemate in Changping undercut that narrative. In Qin's councils of war, voices began advocating for psychological measures to break the deadlock, not just military tactics, but information operations, intelligence work, and the kind of subtle manipulation that had always been part of the ancient art of war. Qin's intelligence networks were second to none. They had cultivated spies, sympathizers, and informants throughout Zhao's kingdom. They understood the personalities in Zhao's court, the tensions between different factions, the egos and insecurities of the powerful men who determined policy. And they had learned something crucial. There was a vocal faction in Zhao's capital that was deeply dissatisfied with Lian Po's defensive strategy. These voices belonged to younger nobles, ambitious commanders, and courtiers who felt that Qin's power had made Zhao defensive and timid. They wanted aggressive action. They wanted their general to take the fight to Qin. Most importantly, they wanted a victory that would silence all doubts about Zhao's supremacy. Chief among these voices was that of a man named Zhao Kuo. Zhao Kuo came from one of Zhao's great military families. His father had been a celebrated general, and Zhao Kuo had grown up steeped in stories of military glory, of heroic generals leading brave armies to overwhelming victories. But Zhao Kuo's greatest military experience came not from actual warfare, but from theoretical discussion. He had studied the ancient texts of strategy. He had participated in countless debates about how wars should be fought. He was articulate, intelligent, and absolutely confident in his understanding of military science. What he lacked was actual combat experience. the harsh lessons that come only from having to adapt plans, to the chaos of real warfare, from having to make decisions when information is incomplete and stakes are measured in human lives. In Zhao's court, Zhao Kuo became the voice of aggressive action. He criticized Lian Po for being timid, for allowing Qin to dictate the terms of engagement, for settling into a defensive posture that he argued would eventually lead to starvation and defeat. Zhao Kuo spoke of the glorious history of Zhao, of how its generals had once commanded some of the finest armies ever assembled, of how Zhao's military spirit had been corrupted and weakened by the defensive mentality Lian Po represented. And crucially, Zhao Kuo's voice found a receptive audience in King Shaocheng of Zhao. The king, influenced by the counsel of these more aggressive advisors, began to lose confidence in Lian Po, the general's steady wisdom. His refusal to be goaded into rash action began to be seen not as strength, but as weakness. Meanwhile, Qin's intelligence operations were carefully cultivating this discontent. Qin sent information into Zhao suggesting that Lian Po might be compromised, that he was secretly negotiating with Qin, that he lacked the courage to fight. Whether these rumors were true or not was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that they reinforced the existing doubts already present in Zhao's court. Psychological warfare, ancient strategists understood, could be as decisive as any physical confrontation if wielded skillfully. The pressure on Lian Po became overwhelming. He sent messages to the king pleading for patience, explaining that the defensive strategy would eventually exhaust Qin and force them to withdraw. But in Zhao's capital, voices were growing louder, demanding action. The king's confidence in his general continued to erode. And then, in a decision that would reshape the course of this campaign and the history of China itself, King Shaocheng made the choice to replace Lian Po with Zhao Kuo. Lian Po was devastated. He had conducted the campaign with precision and wisdom, denying Qin victory and protecting Zhao's army through months of grinding stalemate. Yet in the eyes of his king and the court, his caution was now seen as cowardice. Lian Po realized what was happening, that he was being replaced not because of any military failure, but because of court politics, because ambitious men wanted a different kind of general, one willing to take the kind of risks that Lian Po had wisely avoided. Legend says that when Lian Po heard the news, he wept. For Bai Qi and Qin's command, the news of Lian Po's replacement was worth more than any military victory could have been. They had not broken Zhao's general through superior tactics or strategy. They had broken him through politics and psychology. They had manipulated the system of Zhao's governance to remove the one opponent they could not easily defeat and replace him with someone whose confidence far exceeded his ability. When Zhao Kuo arrived at Changping to assume command, he immediately signaled a change in strategy. Where Lian Po had been measured and cautious, Zhao Kuo was bold and aggressive. He began dismantling the carefully constructed defensive positions, reorganizing the army into an offensive configuration. He announced his intention to engage Qin in direct battle, to prove that Zhao's warriors were superior to anything Qin could field. His soldiers, who had endured months of waiting and frustration, greeted these announcements with enthusiasm. At last, they thought, they would have the opportunity to fight and win glory rather than sitting passively in defensive positions. Bai Qi, observing these changes, realized that his enemy had just given him the opening he had been waiting for. With Lian Po, direct engagement would have been suicidal. Qin would have battered itself against those carefully constructed defenses until both sides were exhausted. But with Zhao Kuo, Qin could now do what it had always done best: engage a willing enemy in open battle and crush them through superior strategy and superior execution. What Bai Qi now set in motion was one of history's great military operations, a masterclass in the application of strategy and deception. Rather than meeting Zhao Kuo's aggressive armies head-on, Bai Qi deliberately withdrew his forward forces. He made Zhao's army appear to be winning, driving Qin back, breaking through their lines. Zhao Kuo, interpreting this as evidence of Qin's weakness and validation of his own strategic genius, pressed forward aggressively, pushing deeper into territory that Bai Qi's forces appeared to be abandoning. What Zhao Kuo did not see, what he could not see, was the trap that was forming around his army. Bai Qi had positioned forces in the mountains and hills surrounding the valley where Zhao's army was now operating. As Zhao Kuo pressed forward in what he believed was pursuit of a retreating enemy, these surrounding forces were moving into position, preparing to cut off his supply lines, to encircle his army, to transform a pursuing force into a trapped one. For days, the deception continued. Zhao Kuo's army pushed forward, suffering casualties but interpreting them as the natural cost of driving back an enemy. Then, suddenly, Bai Qi's withdrawal ceased. The forces that Zhao Kuo had believed to be retreating turned and stood firm. At the same moment, the forces that had been circling in the hills revealed themselves, emerging from valleys and from behind ridges, encircling the Zhao army from behind. Zhao Kuo suddenly realized, with a terrible clarity, what had happened. He had walked into a trap of catastrophic proportions. The Zhao army was now surrounded. Qin forces, superior in numbers and positioning, held all the approaches. Supply lines that stretched back to Zhao's homeland were cut. The army that Zhao Kuo had been confident would crush Qin was now contained, isolated, and in an increasingly desperate situation. Zhao Kuo attempted to organize breakout attacks, to smash through Qin's encirclement and restore supply routes. These attacks were costly and ultimately futile. Qin's forces, well-positioned and under the command of a general of supreme skill, methodically held their lines. As days turned into weeks, the situation inside the encircled Zhao army deteriorated into a nightmare. Food supplies, which had been intended for an army expecting to defeat Qin through superior tactics, now had to be rationed among a trapped force with no prospect of resupply. The men who had marched forward with such confidence, expecting to win glory and prove Zhao's military supremacy, now faced a much grimmer reality. Hunger became the constant companion of every soldier. The wounded piled up with no means of evacuation or adequate medical treatment. Disease began to spread through the packed soldiers. The morale that had been so high weeks before began to crumble. Zhao Kuo, realizing that his army was facing annihilation, attempted to organize one final massive assault designed to break through Qin's encirclement. This attack was launched with the desperation of men who understood they were facing extinction. For a time, it seemed as though it might succeed, as though sheer desperation and courage might overcome the traps that Bai Qi had prepared. But Qin's forces, expecting such a move, held their positions. The assault broke against Qin's lines like waves against rock. Zhao Kuo himself was killed in this final, futile attack. With their general dead and their breakout attempt shattered, the remaining Zhao forces faced a choice between continued resistance that would end only in starvation and surrender. Some chose to fight to the end, choosing death in combat over the humiliation of surrender. Others attempted to flee, scattering into the countryside in small groups, seeking to make their way back to Zhao territory. The vast majority, however, had no choice but to surrender to Qin's forces. In the aftermath of this surrender, something extraordinary and terrible happened. Bai Qi, surveying the enormous number of prisoners now in his custody, estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of men, made a decision that would echo through history. He could not transport, feed, or guard such enormous numbers. More importantly, returning such a vast force to Zhao would preserve Zhao's ability to wage war in the future. The most efficient solution, from a purely military and strategic perspective, was to ensure these prisoners posed no future threat to Qin. And so, according to the historical records, the vast majority of the surrendered Zhao soldiers were killed. Whether this took the form of mass execution or the more gradual consequence of abandonment and starvation is unclear from the historical sources. But the result was the same. An army that had marched to Changping hundreds of thousands strong was almost entirely annihilated. The scale of the destruction was almost incomprehensible to the people of the ancient world. This was not a clash of armies measured in thousands, but in hundreds of thousands. This was warfare, on a scale that pushed the limits of what was logistically possible, and the casualties reflected that scale. The plains around Changping became a landscape of death on such a vast scale that those who survived spoke of it with a kind of awed horror. No battle in the entire Warring States period, before or after, would match Changping in sheer numbers of those killed or captured. News of the catastrophe reached Zhao's capital, and the kingdom reeled in shock. An army that had marched out, expecting to prove the superiority of Zhao's military prowess, had been annihilated. The confidence that had animated Zhao's court turned to despair. The nation's military manpower had been decimated in a single operation. Zhao's ability to wage large-scale warfare had been fundamentally diminished. The dominion that had once seemed assured was now slipping away. In the years that followed the Battle of Changping, the consequences reverberated throughout the warring states. Qin, emboldened by its victory and strengthened by the destruction of its greatest rival's military capacity, moved forward with its program of conquest and consolidation. Zhao survived as a state, but never recovered its position as one of the great powers. The balance of power that had existed before Changping shifted decisively in Qin's favor. One by one, the other states fell or were forced into subordinate positions relative to Qin's growing dominion. Within a generation of Changping, Qin had unified all of China under its rule. The Qin dynasty emerged from this process of warfare and conquest and unified administration, replacing the fragmentary world of the warring states with a single empire. When historians look at the chain of events that led to Chinese unification, they inevitably trace it back to moments like Changping, to the battles that shifted the balance of power decisively in Qin's favor, that eliminated rivals as genuine threats, and that demonstrated Qin's superior military prowess to the remaining states. Yet, the Battle of Changping stands out even among the military successes that paved Qin's path to dominion. This was not merely a military victory, but a triumph of strategy, psychology, and the ruthless application of power. Bai Qi had not simply defeated a rival general, he had transformed the very nature of the conflict through his maneuvering, drawing out an opponent who was overconfident and poorly prepared, then encircling and destroying him with the kind of comprehensive destruction that could not be easily recovered from or avenged. And it bears considering what might have transpired had Lian Po remained in command. History does not offer us this alternative outcome, but military theorists have long contemplated it. Lian Po's defensive strategy was working. It was frustrating Qin, consuming resources, and setting the stage for Qin's eventual withdrawal from the campaign. Had Lian Po been allowed to continue pursuing his strategy of patient defense, the outcome might have been an exhausted draw, a mutual recognition that the cost of continuing the struggle had become unacceptable. The vast armies that marched to Changping might have returned to their home territories depleted but intact. The course of history might have traced a very different trajectory. But history is not written by the hypothetical. It is written by the actual, by the decisions made, by the personalities that influenced those decisions, by the political dynamics that led to Lian Po's replacement and Zhao Kuo's elevation. It is written by the intelligence operations that cultivated doubt in Zhao's court, by the psychological manipulation that made a cautious general seem cowardly, by the trap that Bai Qi laid, and the way that Zhao Kuo walked into it with eyes wide open, yet seeing only what he wished to see. The soldiers of Zhao, who perished at Changping, did not die in some noble cause or in defense of their homeland. They died because of the political machinations of their leaders. because ambitious men wanted a different kind of general, because they were caught between the ambitions of great powers and the strategies of master tacticians. They died because a general who was overconfident in his theoretical knowledge was pitted against one of history's greatest practical military minds. They died because the information that reached Zhao's king had been shaped and manipulated by enemy intelligence operations that understood the vulnerabilities of Zhao's political system. In the centuries that followed, as the unified Chinese empire took shape, and Qin's legalist philosophy began to reshape how humans organized themselves politically, the Battle of Changping was remembered as a watershed moment. Military academies studied it for the lessons it contained about strategy, about the dangers of overconfidence, about the power of psychological manipulation in warfare, about the importance of logistics and supply lines. But as the immediate reality of the battle faded into history, a kind of mythology began to overlay the actual events. Bai Qi became almost superhuman in reputation, a genius whose very presence on the battlefield shifted the odds. Zhao Kuo became the embodiment of arrogance and theoretical knowledge divorced from practical ability. Yet beneath the mythology lay something more human and more complex. Bai Qi was brilliant, yes, but his brilliance was expressed through understanding how to manipulate not just armies, but the political systems that those armies were part of. He understood that breaking an enemy's command structure and confidence could be as important as breaking their military formations. Zhao Kuo was not merely arrogant but ambitious, a man who genuinely believed in the correctness of his analysis, and who had the misfortune of having his confidence rewarded with opportunity precisely at the moment when his analysis proved to be fatally wrong. The Battle of Changping stands as a reminder of how warfare in the ancient world was not merely the clash of warriors and strategies, but the expression of deeper political and psychological dynamics. It shows us how manipulation, misinformation, and the cultivation of political divisions within a rival state could be as decisive as any tactic employed on the battlefield. It demonstrates the terrible cost of warfare at scale and the way that ambition and pride can lead entire nations to decisions that seem rational at the moment, but prove to be catastrophic in hindsight. It also reminds us of the vast gulf between theoretical knowledge and practical ability, between the confidence of those who study warfare in comfort and the harsh realities faced by those who must execute those theories in the chaos and confusion of actual battle. Zhao Kuo was not an evil man, and his reading of military texts was probably accurate within its own context. But knowledge untested by experience, confidence untamed by humility, and ambition unchecked by wisdom can become deadly weapons, not against an external enemy, but against the very people you claim to lead and protect. In the end, the Battle of Changping changed the course of history. It marked the moment when the Warring States period began its final transition toward unification under Qin. It demonstrated that Qin had not merely a larger army or more resources than its rivals, but a qualitative advantage in military thinking and strategic execution. It showed that the old order, represented by states like Zhao, that still clung to the ways of the past, could not compete with Qin's ruthless application of new methods and new thinking. The plains around Changping saw the bones of hundreds of thousands bleached by sun and rain. Those bones were the price of Qin's triumph and the foundation of the unified empire that would emerge. In a very real sense, the Chinese empire was built upon the mass grave of Changping, upon the sacrifice, intended and unintended, of hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers whose names are now lost to history, whose individual stories are now forgotten, but whose collective fate shaped the destiny of an entire civilization. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the Battle of Changping. History is often written by and about the great figures, the brilliant generals, the ambitious kings, the strategic geniuses whose plans reshaped the world, but history is made by the ordinary people caught up in those grand plans, by the soldiers who march because they are commanded to march, by the families who wait for sons and brothers who never return, by the civilians whose cities become theaters of war, and whose lives are forever altered by battles they did not choose and did not want. The brilliance of Bai Qi and the tragedy of Zhao Kuo are now matters of historical record, studied and analyzed for the lessons they contain about strategy and warfare. But the ordinariness of the hundreds of thousands who died at Changping should not be forgotten. They too were part of the story. Their deaths gave that story its weight and its meaning. In remembering the Battle of Changping, we are not merely studying a military engagement or celebrating the triumph of strategic genius. We are bearing witness to the human cost of warfare, the price paid in ordinary human suffering when great powers clash, and when the ambitions of leaders are expressed through the lives and deaths of those they command. The unification of China under Qin, which followed from the victory at Changping, would bring stability and order to a land that had known centuries of fragmentation and warfare. That stability was valuable and important, but it was purchased with the blood of Changping and countless other battlefields. As we contemplate the trajectory of history that Changping helped set in motion, we might well pause to reflect on that price, to remember that the great turning points of history are built upon the suffering of millions, and to consider whether the grand outcomes that history celebrates are always worth the human cost at which they are purchased. The Battle of Changping fades now into the distant past, into the mists of history where certainty gives way to interpretation and legend intertwines with fact, but its significance endures. It marks the moment when one era ended and another began, when the ambitious and the ruthless triumphed over the cautious and the wise, when vast armies clashed and hundreds of thousands fell. It is a story of human ambition and human frailty, of brilliant strategy and tragic miscalculation, of the terrible machinery of war operating at a scale almost incomprehensible to those who survived it. It is a story that echoes across centuries, reminding us of the power of history to shape our world, and of the enormous cost that history demands from those caught in its currents.